Good morning. Glad to see you all here in still sunny Estonia. As a strong and committed supporter of creative industries, using that term, I'm pleased to open this conference with a few words of greeting. To be more precise, those of you with whom I've discussed these issues know how important I consider it to be to develop a new understanding that the arts be treated as an integral part of a nation's economy, not as something separate that we simply subsume under the label culture. In fact, it's not possible to do so, and I argue it's an artificial distinction. It is a false dichotomy, a doubly false dichotomy. Yes, it is crucial that people in business come to understand that our GDP is very much influenced by the arts, that tourism to my country is not simply the result of our alcohol excise tax levels. The creative industries are not reflected, unfortunately, in the country's economic statistics. There is no line comparable to manufacturing or construction in the calculation of the contribution of economic sectors to the national income as reported to Eurostat. Yet we know that what comes under that amorphous protean term culture constitutes a palpable and significant part of what people spend their income and their time on. And since time is money, that's also important. And thus it must be contributing in one way or another that we can measure to the general common weal. And indeed, the problem is we don't bother or we don't know how to measure these things in euros. But this is not a one-sided myopia of measurement that we can decry when it is convenient and defend when necessary. For it is also true that broader acceptance of the importance of creative entrepreneurship also means that in some areas the ivory-storied isolation of what we traditionally have simply called culture, a human activity separate from base and crass business, will come under scrutiny and perhaps even criticism. And that's the other side you have to keep in mind. It is a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. And I just wanted to point this out, that this is especially true in a small society. And it's not, in our society, I would say because of our smallness, perhaps, it's not only culture that has this. With this, we already have this now you see it, now you don't approach when social scientists or pollsters use their absolute get right to engage in political criticism. But when purely political criticism receives a political response, then they say, you're attacking scholarship, you're attacking research. Well, same thing with arts and with creative entrepreneurship. The acceptance of the arts in the national economy also means that hitherto, more than hitherto, people will ask if support for economically non-productive, or to be blunter, unpopular arts is warranted. If you're an entrepreneur, you can't expect different treatment. If you are a business and you fail, the government won't come and bail you out unless you happen to be a bank deemed too large to fail. But otherwise, you're on your own. And so too, when we look at how we proceed in a paradigm of creative entrepreneurship, it's not simply that we are today, things are going well for me, I'm an entrepreneur. And tomorrow things go badly and I'm an artist. So this is something we must keep in mind. I'm not attacking the position, I'm just drawing out a few things that we must keep in mind. Also, the other thing I'd like to point out, which sometimes sort of irks me, but that's that creative entrepreneurship is not a new concept. Indeed, the understanding that art is profitable is at the basis of the transformation of Western society that began with Gutenberg's invention of movable type and the printing press. Until Gutenberg, those people who wrote literature, be it in the time of Lucretius or Catullus, Horace, or even later Dante and Petrarch, knew that they were doing it for a small circle of friends people who managed to buy handwritten copies of what Catullus or Petrarch had written. And that very small group, moreover, was the very small group that not only had the money but knew how to read. Of course, the monks also knew how to read, but they weren't allowed to read Petrarch or Dante, but they also didn't have the money. So we're talking about a very small group of people that constituted the so-called market for writers until 1440, when Gutenberg invented movable type. But besides, since there was no movable type and there was no printing press, there was no need to read, so there was no audience to read, so there was actually no market, to put it in sort of business terms. So how did writers survive? They needed a patron or they needed a day job. Well, they still need day jobs. Patrons are harder to find. But it was technology that changed all that. Gutenberg and the technology he invented meant that books could be mass-produced. Writers could support themselves by their work, i.e. they had become creative entrepreneurs. Literacy became something to be desired by broad masses of people who, nota bene, never earlier knew that reading was something they wanted to do. I just mentioned that because when we talk about the late Steve Jobs, we all say he figured something out that people wanted they didn't know they wanted. Well, so too, this is what happened with books. People did not know they wanted to read. Monks read, a couple of nobles read, but the rest of the people thought, well, what is it? But people wanted to become to read. And of course, this process led, since people have also nasty nature as well, one of the results of having printing press and mass distribution of literary texts led to a change in the legal environment because writers said, you're stealing my book, I need we invent such a thing known as a copyright. Intellectual property came into being, and this whole sphere was actually tied to something as simple as Gutenberg's invention of movable type. And we see this paradigm ever since 1440 repeated to this day with, most recently, pick any example, but your iPad app, Angry Birds. So too, you have the technology, you need the intellectual property. If you create it, invent it, it is profitable for you. So we have to always keep in mind that when we're looking at creative entrepreneurship, that technology has traditionally liberated art forms, and that liberated art forms give rise to new industries, be they iPhone apps or books. So much of what happened with the book, and which I say this today with going on with Angry Birds or with these apps, it actually happened with the invention of the phonograph by Thomas Alva Edison, which allowed recorded music to become widespread and liberating that art form from its earlier constraints. Its earlier constraints were, in fact, Gutenberg-era constraints. That is, if you wanted to reproduce music, you had to have printed sheet music, which you then could, and you also needed to know how to play a piano or read those notes, so you needed to be literate. But now you could actually listen to music reproduced. So that when we look at publishing, book publishing, literary publishing, we look at the music, we see that the arts have long been a part of our economy, significant parts of our economy. And if we look at, say, the music industry today and how big it is and how cutthroat it is, it's also worth noting no one talks about the music industry as the creative economy. It's just business. It's just the industry. People even talk about the area of music as the music industry. So I think we have to know what we're talking about when we talk about creative enterprise, because in fact, they've been talking about the music industry ever since Ira Gershwin. So that when we talk about the creative entrepreneurship as a new concept, then what we're really talking about is a change in attitude toward those aspects of creativity that are not immediately bestsellers and gold records, but rather with the understanding that all forms of art, even the more esoteric and rarefied, have a place in the economy, and that the distinction between popular and so-called elite art is artificial and crude. That is what we're saying, because we know that there is this stuff that's not, that makes a lot of money and is creative. The point is we are trying to get people to understand that the more esoteric aspects, or what has hitherto been esoteric, is also an area of economic enterprise. Question is, when does a musician's or a writer's work become part of the economy? How many books or records does he or she have to sell? Or looking at it somewhat differently, and perhaps disturbingly, do we define art as elite only when it doesn't sell? I don't know. And here we have some examples, many examples, of course. Take the example of a composer for a long time deemed esoteric and elite, Arvo Pärt, from here in Estonia, a composer very little known for many years. In fact, he was repressed by the Soviets, yet who today is known across the world, whose works are performed all over the world. And again, to use the crude language of marketing, is today very much a part of Estonians' brand. Examples of creative artists, such as Arvo Pärt, lead me to think that once we recognize that art is as much of our economy as government finance, investment, promotion efforts, and in this case, undoubtedly no less important in creating a picture of our country, that perhaps we have not fully understood how important it is for a country to support the creative arts. Equally important, of course, and I think this is one area where we need to pay much more attention, is the effective management of arts. Not necessarily by government-employed arts managers, but rather the education and training of people who know how to do the work needed for an artist to be known and to be successful. We recognize that in the case of true artistic genius, that the genius should be allowed to devote his or her time to creating, and not to the work of promotion. But what of those people whose talents are not yet recognized? Who does the work that ensures that they become successful? What I'm trying to get at here is that we must recognize the entirety of the creative enterprise as important. That while it is, I would hope, no-brainer for any of us to understand that in Alvar Aalto or Tõnu Kaljuste here brings recognition, tourists, audiences, commissions to a country like Finland or Estonia, that otherwise would have been known only for their saunas and long winters, it is often more difficult to convince people that an Alvar Aalto or a Kaljuste to become known takes time and effort, and if we leave it up only to the artist, that means time and effort spent on activities that he may not be so good at, and much less time to the activities where he is a genius. A small nation like ours cannot afford the popular but overblown romantic 19th century image of the starving artist in the garret that receives posthumous discovery, recognition, and acclaim like Van Gogh or Emily Dickinson. We need to nurture our arts and artists when they are alive and they are busy creating. Ladies and gentlemen, as the late Steve Jobs repeatedly demonstrated, creativity and artistic vision is not the monopoly of the painter, the novelist, and the composer. What the latter three share with the former is a willingness to innovate, try absolutely new and initially crazy-seeming notions that, moreover, like Beethoven's dissonant opening chord in Eroica, may not find immediate acceptance and may indeed meet with open hostility, if not rotten tomatoes in the case of Beethoven. Impressionism and Cubism, James Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's Wasteland, found little initial understanding. Today we have completely different visions of Ulysses, Eliot's Wasteland, not to mention Eroica. But on the other hand, we need to keep in mind that Ulysses, like D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, were banned in the United States for several decades. They were confiscated if you brought them in from Europe. So that talent is not necessarily recognized early. We need to pay attention to the issue of recognizing talent earlier. Creativity, innovation is not necessarily met with immediate success and acclaim. In this regard, Steve Jobs was an exception, although he too had his difficulties. Immediate success and acclaim cannot be a yardstick by which we measure the performance or the success or the creativity of an artist. The more innovative, the more creative a work in general, the longer the time it takes for acceptance, for people to come to listen to that kind of music, to appreciate those funny-looking paintings, be they Picasso's Cubist works or Monet. So too it is with the really great creative works that are being created today. And here I believe that we need to ensure that the public sector support for the arts remain in place. As with startups, we recognize that not all projects will pan out. I mean, startups meaning computer or IT startups. Not all of them will pan out. In a sense, if I may be so crass, the role of the government is akin to the venture capitalist who invests in a range of projects hoping that one of them will pan out. It may be a crass analogy, but I believe it is a forceful rationale for public support for the arts, especially for those starting out, and especially in a context where we think of art not just simply as an ivory tower activity, but as a part of our economy. Thank you very much.